Hello and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Jessie Kwak. Hey, Jessie, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Jessie's been a guest before in the podcast, but just to give our listeners a little reminder of your background, Jessie Kwak is the author of multiple science fiction series, a supernatural thriller, and productivity guides from chaos to creativity, and from big idea to book, create a writing practice that brings you joy. And we talked about from big idea to book in episode 132. And so Jessie has another book coming out, From Dream to Reality, How to Make a Living as a Writer. And that is what we are going to be talking about today, and specifically about running a freelance copywriting business. And we were just chatting a little bit before I hit record about how this book is coming out. And I thought it would be an interesting background that Kickstarters are all the rage. And so this is like a little bit of a different spin on Kickstarter than I've heard. And Jessie, the book will be out by the time this episode comes out, no doubt. But can you just describe a little bit how the Kickstarter came about, how you're working with your publisher on that?
Yeah. So the publisher is Microcosm Publishing, which we discussed a bit in the past episode about how fun they are to work with. And they do a lot of nonfiction books and a lot of kind of these more really specific, like how to make a living as a writer or how to pickle your own vegetables or very kind of niche fun things. And they have launched, I believe, almost all of their books in the last 5-ish years via Kickstarter. And the books are always done. They're using it more as like a pre-order and as a way of cross-selling other books. And so the fun thing about all of their Kickstarter campaigns is, so for example, with mine, you can get my book, and then they also have other books about writing that they bundle in and other like business guides that they'll bundle in. And so you can go in and like get a small slice of their catalog that is pertinent to whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. So it's a really fun process, and they're really fun to work with.
Yeah, I was just looking at your Kickstarter page, and what I had seen before, and it shows up on all Kickstarter pages as far as I know, which is, oh, here we go. This project will only be funded if it reaches its goal by Thursday, blah, 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 the date. So that's the kind of thing I never really dug too deeply into Kickstarter, although I did talk with Joshua Esso about Kickstarter quite a while ago. But those kinds of things alarm me because it sounds like if you don't get funded, sorry, you're out of luck. But if your publisher's using this kind of as a pre-order, then I can't imagine that that's going to stop them, right? If it doesn't get funded to the expected level.
Yeah, and I said this right before we got on the call, but I got an email last week. The book has gone to print. The book is done. I've written, it's edited, it's at the printers right now. So it's not a matter of if this gets funded, we'll do it. It's already done. But and Microcosm has never run an unsuccessful Kickstarter, as far as I know. They just have a good marketing engine. But yes, that is one of the risks of Kickstarter when you're setting your entry level to it. I was talking with somebody about like how to set that, because I've seen some people will do it like, we're kickstarting it at $100. And if we meet that, then everything beyond that is gravy. And they set it low because they want to make sure and definitely meet that goal. And so somebody was saying good advice on this. If you're trying to think of what should you set your own Kickstarter at, do you intend to do it anyways? Is this something you're going to do no matter what? And you're just using this as a marketing tool? Then set it low because you're going to do it anyways. And that way you'll make sure to fund. If it's more of a test balloon, like, I don't know, I might do this. I might do this box set with a whole bunch of extra short stories in it. If people are interested, Let's do it at Kickstarter and find out. Then set it at whatever level would make it worth your time to actually do. And in complete transparency, I have no idea how Microcosm sets their levels because they have the business acumen and are doing that on their own. But I heard that piece of advice, and that's if I ever do a Kickstarter, that's just all me. That's what I will do for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure just as with ads or anything else, there's a whole art and science behind it. I'm still sitting back and watching to see how other people do it.
Yeah,
I'm
me
definitely
too.
not an early adopter of this kind of thing. So very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So we are going to be talking, as I mentioned, about running a freelance copywriting business. And it's sort of within the context of the How to Make a Living as a Writer book. And so I thought it would be helpful just to start out talking about what your road was to making a living as a writer.
Yeah. So I went to college for English literature, and English lit majors. And I always loved writing and always hoped to write the great American novel, or in my case, I guess I write science fiction. So write the fun American science fiction novels. And I, at school, I didn't really know that there were other ways of making a living writing. You were taught you could go to get an MFA and then teach in an MFA program if you wanted to be a real writer. So it wasn't until I was out of college and working as a waitress and kind of like, I don't want to get an MFA. I don't really know what to do. I met somebody at a bar I was working at. She was one of the regulars there. And she's like, well, you have an English degree. Have you ever thought about copywriting? And I was like, no, I don't really know what that is. She's like, well, I used to work as a copywriter at Expedia. And it was so much fun. I got to write about travel and they paid really well. So if you're ever interested, I'd be happy to talk with you more. So she ended up helping me like put together a resume and look at some different classifieds. And I ended up, through her encouragement, landing a job as a catalog copywriter for a children's company. And I was just writing product copy about sparkly dresses and like light up dinosaur T-Rex shoes and all sorts of fun stuff. So I was like, man, this is great. Like it was so creative and interesting in a way that I had not expected. But I really didn't love the 9-to-5 desk job aspect of it. So within a couple years, I had picked up some freelance clients. I mostly started doing blogging. I also did some more like product copy because I had that experience, and just started leveraging the little bit that I was learning into, okay, well, I can do this now. Maybe I can get somebody to hire me to do something similar. All right, now I found this gig. Maybe I can find somebody who will hire me to do this. And pretty soon I had too many external projects to keep up with a full-time day job. So I made the leap about 2 years after the first full-time position, to be a full-time freelancer. And I have not looked back.
It would be interesting. You were talking about how sort of one opportunity led to another. And early on, I was giving a talk on the importance of networking, and I started doing this diagram. I was probably using PowerPoint or something like that, of I met this person at a local writers group, and I ended up doing this talk because of that connection. And then at the talk, I met this other person that I ended up going to a conference, and then I met, and I somehow lost that file, went into the electronic ether. I don't know where it was. And at this point, I think it would be so convoluted that it wouldn't really be apparent where the lines were going. But a convoluted one almost makes the point better than being able to look at the details, because it is that branching of networks, of community building. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to talking about finding business as a copywriter. So
Yeah.
I think that the first thing that people should be considering, if this is of interest to them, is freelance writing for you? And so if people are thinking about it, what are the things that you would say, oh yeah, definitely you should look into freelance writing? And what are the things where you would say, oh, maybe this isn't for you?
Absolutely. Because I think one of the reasons that I had behind writing this book is that freelance writing is not for everybody. And you should maybe find that out by reading a book instead of spending a couple years trying to get a business started and be like, oh, this isn't my jam. So I really, in this book, tried to lay out, okay, this is what I love about it. This is what's fun about it. This is what's hard about it. And this is what it takes. And so if this doesn't sound like it's for you, totally great. But, keep that in mind. I was joking with my editor that if I haven't talked like 70% of the readers out of starting a freelance business, I didn't do my job correctly.
Yeah.
So that said, I think the people, when I have a conversation with them and talk about, okay, this is what I do for a living, this is how I got here, the people whose eyes light up when I talk about not having a boss and setting my own schedule and the kind of roller coaster of, well, you don't always know where your next month's rent is coming from, but you can drum it up because you've done it before. And you say that to some people and they're like, oh my gosh. And you say that to other people and they're like, oh yeah, tell me more about that. I'm like, okay, you've got the weird bit. That's going to say that's going to help you with this freelance thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that the other flavor of that could be, and I'm thinking of this because this was my experience in starting writing and publishing full time, is if you've been in a corporate gig for a long time and you sock away the money, then
yes,
like I would never be up for signing up for something where like the next month if I wasn't getting a client, I wasn't going to pay the bills. And it was good to have a big buffer to
Yes.
make that
And
transition easier.
yeah, I did not have that when I got started, but I would highly recommend. And it
Yeah.
is something as I'm transitioning now a little bit more towards focusing full time on my fiction business and less on the constant copywriting stuff. And I do have a big buffer now because especially as I'm not 26 and being like, I don't care where, I can eat ramen for forever. I'm like, okay, I'm about to turn 40 and I actually do want to keep my house and make my mortgage payment. Like,
Yeah.
I need a buffer now.
So there's that sort of risk tolerance consideration, I think, for any freelance work. Are there other things that would be either a green light or red light to you if people were talking to you about possibly going into this?
I think a willingness to just experiment and to say yes to projects that you think you can probably do, but maybe don't have the samples for, or you don't have the experience with something. But if well, you know what, I can write a sales letter, I can figure it out, I can learn anything. So I think you have to have that willingness to really learn new things constantly and the interest in learning new things constantly, and not let the fact that you don't know how to do something or don't know about a topic hold you back. I think the ability to research and learn is the hugest part of my job. I once I was interviewing for a position or a gig where I was going to be writing about forklifts. And she listed off some brands, and I used to work in a theater. And so she mentioned Heisters, which are the little like people movers, people lifts I was like, oh, I know Heister. And she's like, oh, good. Do you know about forklifts? I was like, oh, no, I absolutely don't know about forklifts, but I know how to research. And she's like, great. That's all we need.
Well, that clarifies something I was going to ask you, which is how do you balance that willingness to step into an area that you're not an expert in without misrepresenting yourself to the employer?
Yes.
And I think you just answered that question about how to do that.
Yeah. I think there are some industries, like cybersecurity is one where people want you to probably to know a fair amount about cybersecurity, or at least about as a service or whatever it is that will get you into cybersecurity. I have done a fair amount of writing for cybersecurity companies, and I got there by like small steps and by working with a friend of mine who worked in that field and brought me in on a project. And now I can speak enough of the language that people in that space do want to hear that you can speak the language. And there's very like higher ed might be another example. And if you're doing like technical writing, like if you're writing about network systems, like you probably need to actually know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But a lot of what I have done is like content marketing, blogging, where I am not speaking to an audience of experts necessarily. I'm speaking to an audience of people who are learning. So me coming from a perspective of I'm asking questions of the company like, oh, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, right, you don't know. And our audience doesn't know. One of my clients was a digital asset management company, and they specifically worked with like museums and people who had these big image collections. And the guy was like, so do you know anything about digital asset management? And again, I was like, absolutely not, but I can speak to a small business owner audience. And that's what you're looking for, right? You're looking for somebody with that skill set. And he was like, absolutely, because we have so many product people, they can't talk to our audience. They need somebody to be the mediator. So oftentimes that's been my role as the outsider to say, all right, I don't know anything about this. Like, teach me so I can teach your audience.
Yeah. And I can imagine even in those areas like network security or whatever, that even if you didn't have that expertise, as long as you had access to people who did. So there could be, I suppose, a copywriting job, which is we want you to interview Jane, the world expert in this kind of network system, and write it in a way that Jane can't because she's spending all her time in the lab or something like that.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
again, admitting that you don't have that expertise doesn't necessarily cut you off from the job, as long as you can pull that needed information from the people who have it.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the things you emphasize in your book is the importance of choosing a niche. So can you talk about that a little bit? What do you have in mind when you're talking about a niche? Why is it important to niche down?
Yeah. So there's kind of two ways of choosing a niche that I think are really important to differentiate. One is the type of writing that you do. So for example, like blogging or white papers or ebooks or technical papers or email newsletters, the specific subgenre of the craft bit that you know how to do. And you might have a wide range, but if you specifically are writing, sales pages, it's a very different skill set than somebody who's mostly writing ebooks or content marketing blog posts. Like, I could write you a sales page, but somebody who's an expert in sales pages is going to do a better job. And I would probably do a better job at a blog post because that's what I have spent most of my career doing. So there's that. And then there's also like the kind of industry. So the higher education, cybersecurity, hospitality, travel, all sorts of those, specific domain knowledges that you might have. And so I think people either come at it from two different directions. And so if you are coming from a corporate job or a career where you're like, well, I'm an expert in K through 5 education and instructional design because that's what I've done with my career. Getting into freelancing, you're probably going to want to stick in that specific subdomain and you can write a variety of things there. If you're coming at it as a generalist, then you might say, well, okay, I can get pretty good at blogging or product descriptions, like was my experience. I think it's helpful to have examples. So when I started out with really no background whatsoever, I mean, I'd waited tables and I knew theater stuff and I liked beer. I worked in a brewery. So I was like, well, here's some things that I can ease my way into. So I ended up writing a lot of stuff in the like hospitality and restaurant space to get started. And from there, I started getting jobs not just for writing about restaurants, which was fun, but didn't pay very well, to writing for the companies that sold to restaurants. So like the point of sale systems, I got a couple gigs writing for point of sale systems. And from there, it was like, okay, now I'm writing about software as a service. So from here, I can say, hey, I know how to write about software as a service and talk to this digital asset management company, or I've done some higher ed stuff like learning management systems. And so each gig was like, all right, what niche does this open up for me? Is it a different form of writing? For example, okay, I wrote a bunch of emails now, so I can say I know how to write emails. Or is it a different industry? Now I've written for like a farming implement magazine. So cool, now I can write about farming implements. What else can I explore here? So as you're looking at your past experience and as you're starting to get those early gigs, looking at each one in terms of what potential niches does this open up for me? What do I like the most? How can I start formulating my career around a specific set of skill sets in both like the content that I write and the industries that I write for? And once you start getting those connections and having a very strong set of skill sets, that's where you start being like, I can charge $500 a blog post, or I charge $1 a word. And you're not going to get $500 a blog post if you're just writing for a travel magazine that everyone's writing about their trip to, Tucson or whatever.
Yeah.
So
I think that the examples you gave, like breweries to restaurant supply provider, the examples you were giving made sense. It's how there was that progression of the Venn diagram sort of expanded to these other areas. So I think that people who went into it with a particular subject matter area would probably sort of see how that could expand into other areas. I think something that's harder is if you know how to do blog posts, then what's the equivalent next step you can go to? Like, is there any information that would say, if you're good at blog posts, then the thing that's not a blog post, but most like a blog post is blah, blah, blah. Or if you're really good at emails, then a thing that you could expand to is this other format.
yeah. And I do talk about that a little bit in my book, kind of categorizing types of writing via what they're kind of closest to. So you mentioned blog posts, that's your content marketing. So it's that level of somebody's interested in not necessarily your product yet, but interested in, say, how do I get my students to learn better before a test? How do I get them to study better for a test? Is there some sort of solution for that? So they're Googling like test study questions online, and then they run across the blog post that I wrote for a learning management software company where they're like, oh, maybe this product, if I could get my school to onboard, that would be a really good. So as well as the blog posts in that content marketing field, you're going to find like a downloadable ebook that they can either get for free or get as a lead magnet by putting their email address in. You're going to find maybe case studies of other people who have used that product. And so most of the time, the way that I have blossomed out to the next type of content is I'm working with a client, and I'll be like, hey, so I've been blogging for you for a little bit. I wanted to let you know that I also write ebooks and case studies and other things that are similar that you might also need if you ever need that done. And again, whether or not I've actually have samples of that, I can say, this is a thing I know I can write. If you're interested, we could work on that. So that's one way to branch out into different areas.
And when you do this writing, are you credited? Like, do you have a portfolio that you can say, go to this link and you'll see my name? Or is it normally done anonymously? How does that work?
Yeah, so there's three different levels. There would be like a byline where my name is on it. And that has actually been a really great way for me to get new clients because I see that I've written for this online magazine about this topic. So therefore I could probably write for them. And then there is white labeled, which is basically either anonymous on a company's website or maybe it's by the marketing team or something like that, where it's just you wrote it, but your name's not on it. And it's just kind of the company's branding all over it. And then there's ghostwriting, which is what I have ended up doing most of in the last few years. And that is where you're specifically writing in somebody else's voice. So it's a little different from the white labeling in that your name's still not on it, but you, like in my case, I'll interview somebody and then write blog posts from their voice in their writing style. So my name used to be on a lot more things than it is now that I'm mostly ghostwriting, but the payoff is you can charge more if your name's not on it.
Well, let's go to the pricing question because I think everybody's interested in that. There are obviously lots and lots of other details between like picking your niche and then how much do you want to charge that people should go to your book to read about. But I always think that any kind of freelance work, the hardest thing to do is to figure out how much to charge. So can you talk a little bit about how people should go about that?
I tried to address that in my book, but it's so varied and it changes that I didn't want to have like, you need to charge this, this, or this. I recommend trying to choose an hourly rate that you need to hit and then figure out how to hit that from the work that you're doing. And by which to say, I don't mean you say to your client, I charge $80 an hour or $100 an hour. But instead, if you are writing a blog post of 800 words, you know it's going to take you 4 hours. And so therefore, you need to make $400 off that post in order to get your hourly rate of $100. So it's something that you dial in as you've done more of the work. You can use a word rate to kind of estimate that. So, for example, I wouldn't do anything less than 50 cents a word, $1 a word if it's shorter things, like if you're doing email marketing. Sales pages, I don't really write sales pages, but I understand that they can charge more than $1 a word because they're just the point is to make a lot of money off it. So you can say, hey, this is going to bring you in, X amount of thousands of dollars. You can afford to pay me $3 a word for it. Whereas other things that they don't have that same amount of conversion, it's hard to get people to pay as much for.
Can you give an example of the sales page, a scenario where you could be charging $3 a word? Like, are you then writing 100 words? Can you just talk about that a little bit? Like, what kind of output gets that kind of rate?
So, I think we probably have all clicked on, like, sign up for my course and learn how to do blah, blah, blah. And you keep scrolling down and it's like, you get to testimonials and you get to this and you're like, where's the price? And it's just all of this like, now we're going to talk about this and why you need that. Now we're going to talk about this. And so sales pages tend to be pretty long and involved. And there's a science and the psychology to them, which I have not studied, which is why I would not necessarily promote myself as a sales page writer. Although again, as a freelance writer, I'm like, yeah, I could learn that. I could look at a bunch of examples. And if you hired me, I can make you something pretty good, but I don't have the experience to show you that. But yeah, so the sales pages tend to be those kind of long, like, and then, this person got this result. Now let me tell you another story, but first, check out these testimonials. Now watch this video.
I could write those because those drive me crazy. I'm like, just show me the price.
I think that's part of it too. It makes me insane. So
yeah. Yeah, probably helps to write things that you enjoy. Not necessary, but probably helpful.
Yes, yeah.
And I would also think that, I mean, there'd be so many variables. There's the just starting out versus a huge portfolio behind you, which
Mhm.
I've got to believe would impact it. And then there would also be if you're pitching yourself to, I don't know, Johnson and Johnson. I'm trying to pick a big company that might be hiring copywriters
Yeah,
versus Ma's Bakery down the street. Do you
right,
charge
exactly.
different rates for those scenarios, or do you just pick a rate and you look for the clients for whom that rate is appropriate?
Yes, and that is how I have done it. I say, "Well, okay, this is how much I charge per word or how much I charge per blog post." And I will have people say, "Oh, well, you're clearly a very good writer, and I'm sorry we can't afford you." But when I was starting out, I charged far less. I think some of my early blog posts were like $50 a post, which you cannot you can't make a good hourly rate on $50 a post unless you're just writing like a million posts an hour. And that's why there's so much really terrible content on the internet because people don't pay enough for
Yeah.
their content. But I wanted to say on like figuring out what to charge, I had 3 points that I want to make on this. The first being that one, Googling like what do freelancers charge in 2023 or whatever year you happen to be listening to this podcast in, you will find some credible resources. You're going to have to like sift through them, but there will be people that you're like, oh, okay, this person seems to know what they're talking about. And these seem like decent rates. And they'll almost always have a range. Sometimes you'll find a survey of like, we surveyed a, 1,000 freelancers and this is what they're charging. So that's a really good resource. The other thing is asking other freelancers that you might know, which is, you mentioned kind of networking and community. That is one of the key reasons to connect with other freelancers so you can bounce things off and be like, hey, so somebody asked me to write a website for them. What do you charge for that? I've never done that before. So those two things I think are really good resources for you. And then the third point I wanted to make is you mentioned the mom and pop shop versus the bigger company. And yes, yeah, you're going to be able to charge a lot more from a larger company or from a business to business company. So somebody who's selling to other businesses as opposed to somebody who's selling direct to consumers, they tend to have larger budgets as well. So I eventually ended up doing entirely B2B writing content marketing stuff just because it paid better than the business to consumer side. So,
Well, I have two questions. I'll ask the first question related to pricing, and you can probably anticipate what the second question is going to be. But the first one is a platform like Fiverr.
mhm.
So if I go on there and I say, I want to have somebody write a blog post, I'm going to give them a copy of this video and I want them to write a blog post about it. I'm guessing you'll get, in fact, I know because I talked to Dale Roberts about this very topic in another episode, you're going to get some ridiculous span from like $25 to $2,500. But there are a lot of people out there on platforms like Fiverr that will do these kinds of things for almost nothing. Do you feel like you have to adjust your pricing based on what people can get from platforms like Fiverr?
I don't because I am not competing with them. And this has been like a slow process getting again back to the niche. Most of what I do is interview based. Has a specific domain knowledge and it has a specific level of expertise that you're just not going to find on Fiverr. And so none of my clients in the past, let's say 7 years, in the early days, they're like, well, I can find somebody to do that on Fiverr for $20. So why would I pay you 150? But I'm not having conversations with any clients who have looked on Fiverr first before they came to me anymore. And that's just because most of my clients are coming from referrals or I've reached out to them or other places as opposed to they're Googling, I need a copywriter. So that would be, I don't think that it's terrible to get started on Fiverr, but I wouldn't stay there long. That might be a good place to get your first clips. But I also think, especially as we're seeing with the rise of AI, a lot of those
That was going to be my
jobs,
second,
yeah, a
the
lot of
second part of
those
the question. Yeah.
jobs that people are paying small amounts of money to do on Fiverr, they don't care what the content looks like or sounds like or reads like. They care that it has all the keywords in it. And you can get that already out of AI tools. You don't need a human to write a super entry level blog post that you used to have to pay let's say $25 generously for. So that is, if you're getting into freelance writing, especially right now, you're not going to be able to make a living doing those kinds of posts. So I would highly recommend figuring out what robots can't write and making yourself an expert in that.
So that would be the second part of the question, because I think AI is disrupting so many professions. And if it's not disrupting it yet, at least there's disruption on the horizon. We've heard many anecdotal stories, or maybe people have played around with ChatGPT and put in some, write me a blog post about this, and something comes out. And it's surprisingly good for not having had any human interaction. Is that something you're planning into your business plan? Like how to deal with greater and greater access to better and better artificial intelligence for this kind of content?
I think the way that I'm building it into my plan is pivoting more towards ghostwriting, and in practicing and getting as good as I can at being that person that when you hire me to ghostwrite a book for you or a blog post, you're like, oh man, I could barely write this as good for myself, let alone anybody else. And so I've had several clients say, well, now I have a Jessie problem, which is that I used to be able to hire other people to ghostwrite stuff, and now I can't. I just have to keep hiring you because nobody else can do it that good. And so that's how I'm trying to pivot my business away from things that robots can write. And I know it's going to get better and better, and it's going to, like fiction, novels, how is that going to impact it? And it's interesting intellectually and scary viscerally to be thinking about those things. But yeah, we do need to be looking at them and figuring out how that's going to impact us. In terms of actually using AI, that is something that I think could be really helpful, especially with, like, I use Otter AI. It's not an AI, it's just Otter.ai for transcription. And that is getting smarter and smarter at transcription and dictation. And I imagine they're probably moving it towards like, okay, how can we, take your marketing sales call or whatever, and then make that into several blog posts that you can just put on your website. And so I'm really curious to see how that can be a tool. With AI is not going to be able to interview a client in order to get what I need in order to ghostwrite something good. So there's still that that human part needs to happen. But I think AI will be a tool that I can use in the writing, but I can't see it replacing my skills just yet. But 5 years ago, I would have said it could never replace a good ghostwriter. But now I'm saying just yet. There's been a lot of developments.
I'm surprised at how many people say, well, AI will be able to do this, but it'll never be able to do this other thing. And I always want to say, really? Because writing a novel is a perfect example. I think a couple of years ago, people would have said, a robot can never write a novel. But I'm betting you that right now, I could go on to any one of the publicly available free platforms and take a story. I always say this, trying not to offend anyone, but let's just say some genres are more formulaic than others.
Yeah.
And you feed in all the variables, like let's say Hallmark movies, and you feed in all the possible protagonists, all the possible locations, and all the possible fill in all the blanks. And then you hit the button and it goes, bing, here are like 537 combinations that we could do. And I'm going to read all the Hallmark movie scripts, and then I'm going to write something for you. Pretty sure it would be not that different than what a human scriptwriter would write. And I think that you look at different kinds of genres, different kinds of writing, and the less formulaic it is, then the longer it will take. But I feel quite confident that in 5 or 10 years, machines will be able to write mystery novels, which, short of literary fiction, I think would be one of the most difficult and least formulaic, because that's what I write. So, of course, I'm completely biased about it. But, I think that there will be machines that are writing that stuff that will be indistinguishable from what a lot of human writers can write. And I think the same is true of any kind of content. And so the question is, how does one hold on to the advantage of being a human being? Like, I think you're saying this aspect of interviewing people is something that is much further out. Like, I think it's out there pretty eventually, but that it's further out on the timeline. So you can bank on that longer because the humans still have the advantage in that area.
Yeah. I'm not sure what's coming, but yeah, if you are looking to get into freelance writing or really any sort of career is being affected by AI at this point, it just, you have to be aware. You have to go into it with eyes open. There was a couple years where I'm like, I'm just not going to read news about AI. And I
Yeah.
was like, no, I have to go.
Well, I
Not
would
going away.
imagine that the really furthest out aspect of content creation, like we're talking about with AI, would be someone comes to you, they want you to ghostwrite a book for them. They start telling you the story, and you, as the ghostwriter, say, I hear what you're saying. I'm writing down all the notes, but you know what? The direction you're taking it is just not very interesting. But I'm
Mhm.
seeing this nugget of a really interesting thing in one of the comments you made. Like, okay, maybe someday machines will be able to find that, but maybe not within our lifetimes. And so those things where you're not only creating content, but you're steering the client toward the most productive type of content, um,
Yeah.
could be
And
another thing where the humans win.
yeah. So I ghostwrite business books, and they tend to be, my clients will come to me and say, okay, there's going to be 10 chapters. Each one's going to be on this topic. Like, they're experts and they know what they want. And even still in those conversations, I've had clients be like, well, can I just like talk through, like go on a walk and dictate what I would want in this chapter? And I'm like, yeah, but it's not going to be as good as if we talk, because I'm going to have questions for you. I'm going to see connections that you're not going to see. And this will be a much more collaborative process. And my most recent client, he was reading through the draft and he's like, I can't actually remember what of this is mine and what's yours. Like, did you put this example in here or did I give you that example? I'm like, no, actually that was, I made that up, but it was based on something you said earlier. He's like, yeah, because that's exactly what I would have said, but I don't remember saying it, and this is weird. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good way of encapsulating it. The seeing the connections is something that I think that the humans will have sole access to for quite some time.
I hope.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you about is that we talked early on about splitting your time between your copywriting work and your fiction work. So I was just curious to find out how you allocate your time. How do you decide when you need to adjust that allocation?
Yeah, that was a very difficult thing to figure out when I was first starting out, especially because, as I mentioned, I was not charging very much. So I had to work a lot longer hours to make a fraction of what I'm making now. And so part of that was just scaling up my income and scaling up my prices in order to free up and buy back some of my time. But once I was able to do that, that took a couple years of scrambling, which hopefully if you're starting out with a little bit more experience, you'll get there faster. But I eventually, my ideal schedule is writing fiction in the morning and then my freelance work and things like that in the afternoon, because that tends not to be, it doesn't require that like isolated creativity that you need when you're trying to create something out of nothing, as
Yeah.
opposed to trying to create a blog post out of a transcript or something where it's like, okay, this is a different sort of creative energy. So I could do that better in the afternoons than the mornings. So I either split my days, or as I'm doing more of these big like business book ghostwriting projects, now I'm more splitting my weeks or months. And so I will take on a new project and that'll be 3 months worth of really intensive work and then a month or two of a break and then back to that for another month. And so I will then focus on, all right, now I've got a few weeks where I don't have any other work. I don't have another project starting until beginning of March. So this is the time where I focus on wrapping up edits on this other book that I'm working on for me. So I either split my days morning and evening, or if I can, push freelance work all into like little siloed days so that I can have multiple days in a row to work on my fiction projects.
Yeah. I like that idea of making the chunks as big as possible because it's just that much less task switching to try to get your
Yeah.
mind from that first kind of creativity you described to the second kind of creativity you described. So cool. Well, Jesse, thank you so much. Please let the listeners know where they can go to find out more about you and your upcoming book and everything you do online.
Yeah. So jessiekwak.com, JESSIEKWAK. That's where you're going to find that my fiction. You'll find links to the nonfiction. And yeah, everything I do is on there in some sort of way. If you want to go directly to the nonfiction books, chaos2creativity.com will take you there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.